Hello, I'm Louis Dorian, and I am the founder of psychedelics.com. And I began my experimentation and journey with psychedelics in the spring of 1995. And my motivations for using psychedelics were probably different than a lot of my peers. I was interested in martial arts. I had grown up in a pretty rough area. I'd gone to some rough schools. I experienced violence fairly early on, serious violence early on in the fifth grade. And I had got involved with martial arts. And one of my early martial arts teachers had this idea that through meditation and discipline, one could achieve mindsets, conscious shifts, consciousness, awareness of types that would lead to a higher level of proficiency and capability in fighting, in self-defense, in combat. And that idea is not that foreign to the martial arts world, actually. And in the Japanese culture, they had a word called mushin. That word refers to, for lack of a better explanation, that flow state. For those of you who experienced it, athletes experience it, maybe musicians probably may experience it. This feeling of just being turned on and you just can't do anything wrong. Like everything is just on point and you are just kind of flowing from one transition to the next, from one step to the next. And so I was pursuing the ability to do that at will. And I think that's a pretty difficult thing, to be able to turn on that flow state at will. And I had heard a rumor that early martial arts teacher of mine was using psychedelics on top of meditation, on top of that discipline. And being a young, impressionable teenager, I ran out and right away was going to do psychedelics. And so my first experience was with LSD. The first two experiences that I had weren't very big experiences. They weren't earth-shattering. They weren't major breakthroughs. I got my first experience with some like tracers and a little bit of like melting, surfaces and small things like that. And I did have my first kind of experience with anxiety there in that first LSD trip, but it passed, and I, kind of started talking with my trip buddies, and that was that. But on the third attempt with LSD, I had this nondescript white blotter. For whatever reason, I decided I was going to take 3 of these tabs, which I had never done before, and I took 3 of those things and walked over to a friend's house, and this was, it was earth-shattering. I experienced what people would call, I guess, Christ consciousness. I experienced a complete dissolution of ego at one point, and I was with some friends, and this kind of happened in a way that I was not a best control of set or setting, actually, I should say, and definitely no understanding of set in my own set, and definitely no work on past trauma or anything like that. I was, barely 17 years old and pretty dumb kid, and had taken all this LSD, and I got left at a high school beer kegger party, and had this experience that I was talking to Christ. And I say Christ because it wasn't a man, it wasn't Jesus, it wasn't a person. This thing that I spoke with was a indescribable entity, honestly, and non-human, very forgiving, but also indifferent in strange ways. Kind of showing that here is the light, here's the path, it's up to you to choose it. And that journey, I don't have time to go into the full description of that trip. It's in some ways humorous. A lot of things happened, but I won't go as deeply into that because I've got many more things to cover. I ended up going home, where I then experienced the opposite. So I was in a state of utter bliss when I was in that presence of Christ consciousness. When I got home, it completely shifted. And of course, it took me many years to really figure out what happened there. I had somewhat abusive father, and I had some dark things there at the house. And so when I went home, I kind of found myself in this biblical hell, which felt quite literal to me. And I was in this fire and brimstone. I saw demons and Lucifer, and I thought that I was already dead and in hell and in eternal damnation. It was very biblical and really unpleasant, really awful. I got naked in my parents' home, and that was when my parents found out that I was experimenting with things a little harder than marijuana. And of course, back then, the ideas around psychedelics like LSD were very different than they are today. And the idea was you're damaging your brain. You know, maybe for those people who are in the know, people who really knew maybe the science behind that, maybe they knew better, but we didn't as kids. I didn't know that. You know, there was weird urban myths out there about, oh, if you take, you know, 1 tab of acid, you're clinically insane. Weird things that people would say back then. So, yeah, it was a different time period. Clearly, my parents were not happy about the choices that I was making. And it progressed from there. I actually then experimented later with Datura, not much later, actually. Datura is a very dangerous plant, but I had extremely powerful and positive experiences with it. Interestingly enough, that martial arts teacher that had indirectly influenced me to try psychedelics became aware that I was, you know, headed down that path a bit, and really admonished me to never touch the Datura. But I was too curious and I wasn't going to do that. I also knew that other friends of ours and people in the neighborhood had made bad mistakes with it. And because of that, I did approach it with a great deal of respect and a bit of fear. And so I took very little amounts of it. A lot of the mistakes that kids made back then and people do make to this day, I think, is make teas with it. They don't know the doses they're getting, and I'm not encouraging anyone to take Datura. It is a serious undertaking. But I did take it, and I took only the root. I didn't eat the seed pods. You can do different things with it. I had extremely powerful experiences. I did about 5 times in my life, and each time it showed me some deep truth of the nature of reality and our perceptual experience of consciousness that would be very hard to explain here. I could tell you that it was directly linked to thinking and thought and routines, and how that affects our ability to perceive reality and what we perceive in reality. But again, not going too deep into this stuff. And so, you know, I had an atheistic home that I grew up in. That was one of the other reasons why I was motivated to try psychedelics. My parents were educated atheists, believed in intellectualism, you know, believed in science, and had seen, I guess, you know, had been influenced by negative perspectives on religion. And so the atheistic perspective, without explanation of why we're engaging in the things, I really hated school, actually, which is sort of funny. I really didn't like school from a very early age. I didn't like the structure. I didn't like the way society felt. And I thought, well, why are we doing this? And so without any type of spiritual underpinnings, it all just felt very empty to me. So that was why I felt compelled to venture into the psychedelic realms. And I ended up going quite deep into that world. And in order to fund these journeys, because back then, you know, drugs were expensive, I started to dabble in the street pharmacy realm of things and selling marijuana, and also selling things like mushrooms and LSD, and getting into that world a bit, which was very dangerous back then. I would say, especially in the town I was in, it's dangerous at any time you're engaging in illegal activity. But yeah, it was very dangerous, and there was a lot of gangs around. There was a lot of things. I started to edge into getting into trouble. And I, for a time, was homeless. And that was some of the happiest times of my life, when I was really living as this kind of gypsy vagabond and just doing LSD and hitchhiking around and sleeping on people's couches, sometimes sleeping in cemeteries. One cemetery in particular. Not every cemetery is a comfortable place to sleep. But I would live this way for a while, and then I kind of succumbed to the pressures of the parents and life, and I got pulled into the economic world and into the structure of our society, and I'm not sure how I feel about that now, because maybe there was an opportunity to develop skills around being sort of a Rastafarian type of individual, and I think I would have had a lot more peace of mind, and maybe I would have less of the damage that I've caused myself through living a pretty dangerous and wild life and very stress-filled life. And, I didn't understand any of the mental health things I understand now, and I didn't understand the 8 root fundamentals of mental, emotional, and spiritual healing and skill development. And my father became ill. We had a very strained relationship, my father and I. My father had hidden a lot of things from myself and my mother, quite honestly, and he had grown up and was born in 1930 in Manhattan and had been involved in the Italian mafia, which he hid from me his entire life. And that created a certain feeling of hypocrisy because he was actually a mathematician, a professor of mathematics, but did not behave like one. He had a very angry side, and he would fly into rages and get into road rage incidents with people and initiate fist fights and really crazy stuff for a math professor. And so there was all these things that had contributed to a certain mental health environment for myself. And my father became ill. We had a strained relationship, and he spent 3 years battling colon cancer and died a very hard death. And my mental health deteriorated. During that time period, prior to all that happening, from 1995 to 2002, I took several thousand hits of LSD. I'm not sure what the estimate is right now. Many trips. I did a lot of trips with mushrooms and psilocybin, not nearly as many as LSD. I have the most experience with LSD of any other psychedelic. And but I had a good amount of experiences with psilocybin and a good amount of experiences with 2CB, which is one of my favorites. Good amount of experiences with, actually a moderate amount of experiences with MDMA, and a moderate amount of experiences with mescaline-based psychedelics like San Pedro cactus and peyote. And then I also had a sort of binge experience with DMT. And so that kind of rounded me out. And as my father became ill and was headed towards his deathbed, I began doing really ridiculous things. So I took approximately 60 hits of LSD in 1999 in June at a clandestine desert rave event called Moon Tribe. It was an anniversary party. I don't know what anniversary year that would have been. And I ended up taking that amount of LSD. Again, these stories are all their own individual stories. I'll tell them in other videos and other talks. But that was that didn't go well. It went very hard. I was I got exposed to some things on that LSD trip that really burned into my soul. I'll tell you that, and it had a lot to do with my father, and I didn't understand the trauma that was there that needed to be healed, the damage that was there between my father and myself, and I had no understanding of the type of emotional journey work that I do now. So again, not understanding the 8 root fundamentals, I just kind of was going along taking psychedelics in a really wild and aggressive way. About 6 months later, I decided to do it again. At this point, my father was fully diagnosed and very ill, had surgery to remove a piece of his colon, and then was on chemotherapy and radiation, all those things. And it was Millennium New Year's. I took about an ounce of mushrooms, 28 grams of mushrooms, 30 tabs of LSD combined, and had a rather horrific experience again. This time I was arrested. The arrest was the best part of that experience. That was an amazing moment. Again, its own story. The arrest signified that I was going to live through the night. I actually had attempted suicide several times that evening under complete psychosis, psychotic delusion. I had taken that dosage in Ocean Beach. I will tell these stories. I know that it sounds interesting to delve into these, and I will tell these stories separately. So that was my journey, and then my father died. I had no idea what was actually happening. I was kind of going through this subconscious motivation to address death, and I didn't get that. I had no clue, and so I was taking very large amounts of psychedelics to kind of have some sort of Faustian duel with death, I guess, because I had this the young man's disease of thinking that I was invincible. And boy, that it's very dangerous to be a young man, because thinking you're invincible can lead directly to your demise. And so, that was kind of what got me in. It got me into this world. That was my entry into the world of psychedelics, right? And that was the first 7 years or so. After that, I went into deep mental health crisis. My father, right as he was really at the worst point of his suffering and dying, I developed serious panic attacks. It was quite ironic, because my panic attacks and, of course, depression and anxiety that come with those was at the same time that the Emmy Award-winning show The Sopranos was on the first season, and Tony Soprano, the mob boss there, was having panic attacks. And it was wild because, interestingly enough, my parents really liked that show, so they were watching it all the time. And I started to, have this same thing that Tony was having, although internally it felt very different than how it looked on the screen. It was absolutely frightening. Feels, this impending sense of doom, and felt like I was dying, thought I was having heart attacks. So went to the doctor a few times at the ER. They hooked me up to EKGs and everything. It's kind of, for people who have that type of panic disorder, initially you think you're having a catastrophic physiological problem, and then you find out you're not. It's almost worse when you find out you're not, because then it just feels like you're completely losing your mind. So after a couple of times, they sent me to an outpatient clinic without really telling me what the outpatient clinic was, and that was because I was very candid about the drug use I had. It's my 7 years, of very intensive psychedelic usage frightened me, because I was still under the scripting, societal scripting, and beliefs that psychedelics were these damaging, terrible things, and maybe I damaged my brain in some way, or there was some problem there, and I didn't understand how grief works and how trauma works and all those things. So, I was very candid with doctors, and that kind of fed directly into the societal bias, and the doctors sent me to this outpatient clinic, which turned out to be an addiction facility. Now, I was not an addict. I smoked pot back then. I smoked a lot of it, too much of it. And I discontinued pot because I couldn't. When I'd smoke pot, it would immediately, marijuana would immediately trigger these panic attacks. And so I discontinued marijuana voluntarily. I discontinued all drug use, including even any alcohol of any kind, caffeine, nothing. I had been completely sober for a number of weeks before I went to the clinic. When I went to the clinic, I figured out what it was. They're like, oh, you're an addict. That was very interesting. They started labeling me as an addict. I was like, But I was so scared of the panic attacks I was having, because I was having these panic attacks 15 a day, vomiting, almost losing, consciousness, scared to drive, because if I had a panic attack behind the wheel, I'd start to feel like I'm losing consciousness. And that was probably quite dangerous, because, in some rare cases, I pretty much did. I never fully passed out the way Tony Soprano did, but I came very close, where I was like kind of really out of it from hyperventilating, I guess. And so, it was really, really frightening. And I went to this clinic. I was willing to do anything. I was beaten down. I was humbled to the ultimate. I would try anything. And so if standing up and saying, I'm an addict, my name is, Lewis, and I'm an addict, and this is my story, was going to fix me, I would do it. The problem is that they started to prescribe the psychiatric medications to me. So they prescribed the SSRIs, they prescribed neuroleptics, they prescribed Paxil, Seroquel, antipsychotic drug, Xanax, those things. And I said to them, this kind of doesn't feel right to me, because you're saying I'm an addict and then you're trying to pump me full of drugs. And and they try to give me this argument that if you were a diabetic, you'd take your insulin, of a totally non-analogous situation, totally different circumstance, and they're trying to convince me to take these medications. It's one of the things that this experience in my life led me to really lose faith in our Western medical system, and it almost led to my suicide. I did not take the medications simply because when I tried even Paxil for one day, I got the wrong feeling. And it was funny, because now that I look back, I feel like LSD protected me. All those experiences with LSD made me so empathic and so in tune with my body. When I took that drug, I said, no, this doesn't seem right. And I didn't continued to take it, and that was, again, more forceful kind of persuasion was coming from the doctors. Oh, you need to take your medications. The drug Seroquel, the fact that it was an antipsychotic drug, really frightened me, because I said, wait a second, I know what reality is. Now that I know I'm not physically dying, I know that's not what's happening. It's just scary as hell to feel fear in its unbridled kind of intensity. So I understood that. It wasn't like I was talking to people who weren't here. I wasn't hearing voices. It didn't make sense to me. So I didn't take those drugs, and I'm very thankful I didn't now. Because several of my friends died because of some of these drugs, with improper use sometimes, improper prescriptions in others. A friend of mine died, I would say, as a direct result of Seroquel. Another friend of mine died as a result of lithium and I think Zoloft and a few others for different reasons. The friend who died as a result of Seroquel shot himself. The friend who died as a result of the lithium the mood stabilizers and the SSRI Zoloft died because of a heart attack. He was only 21 years old. Sadly, was not taking the medication properly. Starting, stopping, smoking a lot of cigarettes. It killed him. He had a heart attack. So I'm glad I didn't go down that road. And I'm not here to just crap all over big pharma's products. I just think they're overprescribed and maybe used a little too recklessly. But there may be a reason for them to kind of get you over the hump. If you're right there at the edge about to take your life at any moment, maybe it makes sense to try and back someone off the edge, but to keep them on them forever and ever and ever the way they do. And it's really interesting, as being a facilitator, I've noticed that people who have taken SSRIs for any extended period of time seem to have difficulty feeling a normal dosage of, say, psilocybin or even LSD. They have to take more of it, or even like DMT. They seem to be numbed out, and it takes a lot of work to get them past that point. So there's some interesting just observations I've had with that. But yeah, that was where I lost trust, and I began to realize that psychiatric medicine seemed to be not exactly a science. Yeah, and they never did any brain scans on me, right? They didn't know what was going on neurochemically with me. They just decided, here, take these meds, and that was very concerning. Luckily, I did finally go to a very good psychiatrist at my mother's research and help, because I was very much suicidal. I spent 9 months just away from any medical attention and just trying to go back to graduate school and focus. And I was having panic attacks every day. I felt like I couldn't even walk across campus. I couldn't go to the gym. The gym, for whatever reason, triggered panic attacks. So I was really in a bad place. And I certainly wasn't taking psychedelics anymore. And so my father had passed, and it was about 2 years before I actually did San Pedro cactus for a kind of a re-entry, and then did psilocybin for the first time. And I didn't shed a single tear of my father's death until I took psilocybin that time 2 years later. And then I had my first grieving moment over my father's death, and that was very powerful. Wow, I felt a change. It was not a pleasant experience. The trip was harsh, very hard. I would actually say it was pretty much a bad trip until I made it through that, and I grieved, and I really cried over my father. And that was when I started to really realize, like, these people have this wrong. Like, even though I had this wealth of background with psychedelics, but this was like the beginning of this kind of full circle. But I had become really disillusioned with society. I had gotten out of the graduate program without completing my PhD and went to work for the government, and I was absolutely miserable during this time. And so I got into the world of cannabis and got deep into the underworld of dealing and trafficking and transporting and those kind of things. And I got myself in trouble. I went to prison a couple times, twice, over a 13-year period. Never for very long, luckily only about a year each time, and didn't serve the whole time inside. Got to do some house arrest time, work release time, things like that. But I certainly got to ride that wild ride. I was in a hostage situation in which we were going to be murdered. It was a bad marijuana deal, went bad. It was a $50,000 deal. The guys were going to kill us. We're very lucky to walk out of there. I fought a strange fight with those guys. I'm not going to get into it here. It was no born identity, let me tell you. It was something very different, very psychedelic, actually. And I'll have to tell that story. That story, I was sober, but I went into a psychedelic realm. Something in me snapped in the moment while that was happening. We were hostage for about an hour. Yeah, probably an hour or so. That was life-changing. And then in 2007 or 8, well, 2007 is when that happened. 2008, I met one of the great loves of my life. I spent 6 years kind of really getting into a deep relationship with her, but she was a very wounded creature, and she had been witness to the murder of her first love, and because of that, she had addiction problems, and she ended up dying of an overdose in 2014, December. And that brought me really to where I began to delve into the mental health. That was more painful than when my father died. My father died was extremely disruptive to my mental health. When she died, it just hurt. It hurt like nothing I've ever felt before. So I got into healing. I got into doing what I call emotional journey work. That word is used a lot. It's an emotional processing that's done through this idea of negative emotions are layered, and it's kind of a mixture of meditation, guided meditation, hypnosis, and Gestalt therapy, if that's the quickest way to say it. And I started utilizing that. The way I discovered it is a book by a woman named Brandon Bays called The Journey, A Practical Guide to Healing Your Life and Setting Yourself Free. And I began looking for people to do this practice with. And eventually I started to find people, and I found the head of the design team for the website. He ended up being one of my main and longest journey work partners. We probably did a few hundred hours, I estimate, of work, possibly 300 hours. And we really made serious strides, and I started doing journeys for other people. And at some point we realized, wow, if you mix this process with psychedelics, what a powerful thing. It was like peanut butter and jelly. And so through all of that, I began to realize, it took some time, but I began to realize what the 8 root fundamentals of mental, emotional, and spiritual healing and skill development are. And so the first root fundamental is exposing and processing past trauma. And that can be done in a number of ways, but one of the least effective ways is direct kind of talk therapy. It appears, and especially some of the larger, authoritative scientific communities have discovered that emotions aren't just in your brain, they're stored in your body. I think many of us here know that we realize that trauma is actually stored in the cells of our bodies. So talking about it isn't really going to be all that effective. Talking is important, but it doesn't remove that trauma from the body. And that's why another reason why I think psychedelics are so helpful in this. They can dig into that deeper part of ourselves that I don't think is just in our brains. I don't even think consciousness is really in our brains after all the psychedelics I've done. So processing past trauma and all the different ways that can be done, that is the first root fundamental. Second root fundamental is not doing. And not doing is a term that I use because other people might say meditation or something like this. And it gives you this emphasis that you're working on some sort of activity. And I think it's important to explain that the goal of this practice is not to be working on anything, including even thinking. So completely not doing. And you'll notice when people have a lot of deep trauma that's unprocessed, they have a very difficult time sitting still and not doing anything without some sort of stimulus. And that's when you'll start to notice that the fundamentals are all linked with each other. So not doing is very much linked with past trauma. If you spend enough time not doing with no stimulus whatsoever, you will start to come face to face with yourself, and you will come face to face with the demons that are inside of you. And so it's definitely linked. The third root fundamental is connecting with nature. And connecting with nature, you notice a couple of things. One, you can see the cycles of doing and not doing, and nature moves in these cycles. But also a strange and interesting observation you might make is that nature seems to do more of the not doing than doing. And we humans seem to be on the opposite end of the spectrum, pointing to our lack of harmony with our world, with our environment, with our natural environment. And I think that is a problem with our species. The other thing that you'll come face to face with while interacting and connecting with nature is death. And death is a very important concept that here in the West we completely kind of sweep under the rug and act like it doesn't exist. We really don't, outside of like the old kind of wake situation where we have an open casket, most of the time people don't even do that often anymore, I don't believe. You don't see the body. And so there's this, I think, unhealthy fear and denial of death in the West. And death is really what makes this life magical. It really is the thing that is the underpinning that tells us we don't know everything and that we'll never know everything. I think that there are certain camps in both the religious and the scientific community that believe that they have all the answers, or at some point will have all the answers. And I'm here to tell you that no, you'll never have all the answers. And that's because there's three categories of knowledge. There's the known, what we know now, the unknown, that which we can discover through pursuits of study or what have you. And then there's the unknowable. And the unknowable is unknowable because it is the experience of perceiving reality in a state where there is no thought. And I've only experienced this a couple of times in my life, but it does exist. And when you are in that place, there was no way for me to, or anyone to transmit what knowledge there is that's there, what that experience is. It is the ineffable. And I believe that's what art is. Art is the beating around the bush to try and describe that which is indescribable. And so, that's the magic of our lives is really hinged on our deaths. And it's, I think, unfortunate that we are so absolutely afraid of it. It's so in denial about it. The fourth fundamental is our beliefs, what we believe. And I think oftentimes people underestimate how powerful it is what they believe. It's not the thoughts that actually cause the negative mindsets and moods and funks that we get into. It's not thinking that does that. It's believing the thoughts that does that. Belief is where the power actually lies. And when we're in a skill deficit and we're missing some of these root fundamentals, we won't maybe realize that we have an automated operating system happening inside us. What it is it's an amalgamation of past trauma and early teachings from childhood and our parents and society that come together to create this kind of automated reactionary operating system that drives our responses to things. And there's a lot of beliefs that are happening at light speed. They happen automatically and they're taken for granted, and we don't even take time to go, wait a second, why do I believe that? What are the facts? What is the evidence I have to really hold on to that belief? What is that belief doing for me in a positive or negative way? If it's negative, why am I holding on to it? If it's causing me pain, is there some reason to hold on to it that's practical? And I think a lot of times we humans can be rather stubborn around beliefs and not be practical with our beliefs. And I'm not going to get too deep into that, but there's a lot of beliefs even around the idea of the use of tools like substances, around our interpersonal relationships, around our sexual relationships that can be very harmful and really be causing us a lot of pain that we don't realize. The fifth fundamental of mental, emotional, spiritual skill development healing is our relationships. Relationship building, relationship maintenance, and relationship repair. And I think many people are lacking in the relationship repair department, but all of those. Because relationship repair is very structured. There are 5 steps to relationship repair. And those 5 steps really, if they're followed all the way to completion, can have a very powerful effect in reestablishing and healing a relationship, and also preventing whatever the transgression or issue was that caused the wound in the first place. And people often don't do that. They get an apology, they go through some desperation over feeling lonely or whatever it is, and they just go right back to kind of where they were before. And oftentimes they go through these cycles of negative interaction with someone, some significant person that's in their life. The sixth root fundamental is the diet and exercise, which I think we often underestimate how powerful that is on our mental well-being, and breath work. And breath work is one of those, it's so powerful, I almost made it a separate fundamental, but it's right in there. I mean, diet is probably just as powerful as breath work, but breath work is amazingly important. Exercise is important. Breath work, when done diligently and really pursued, certain types of breath work can lead to profound experiences. People claim having experiences as profound and powerful as a full-on DMT breakthrough, right? So very, very important skill set there. The seventh root fundamental is very simple. It's embracing discomfort. And that's going to be important for almost all of these fundamentals. So again, you start to see where they're connected. Processing, exposing and processing past trauma, not a comfortable thing. You kind of have to embrace that discomfort. Not doing, for many of us who are in this fast-paced, dopamine-filled world with screen times and everything, not comfortable. Interacting and connecting with nature, depending on how you do it, might not always be comfortable. Go out to the desert when it's a little too warm or too cold. Spending time in places where you don't have all the comforts of home. That it might not be comfortable, but it's necessary. Fourth root fundamental of deconstructing your beliefs and really looking at what you believe and why you believe. That can be very uncomfortable and even scary for some folks. So embracing discomfort there is important. Diet, exercise, breath work, same thing. So discomfort is really, an integral part of all this as a part of growth. The eighth root fundamental is the culmination of all of these. And this is where my theory hinges. And, this is going to be up for debate. There's going to be many people who will probably disagree with me on certain things. The first important part is going to be the definition. So the eighth root fundamental is diminishing one's ego. Now, ego can be defined in different ways. And in some people's definitions of ego is a necessary part of life for you to survive and kind of sustain and even feed yourself and live. That is not my definition of ego. There's all these, greats through history, Sigmund Freud and Jung and these guys who talked about some of this subject. My definition, and I'm using the word ego in sort of the Eckhart Tolle way. If you notice, he never gives you a flat out definition because it's not really possible. It's one of those things we're kind of beating around the bush. It's a mentality and consciousness within ourselves that is constantly obsessed either with the past or the future and always in a competitive or comparative mindset, and always in a self-serving state. That particular aspect of our human nature is what I call ego, and it serves no positive purpose for us. The Toltecs saw this as, they didn't use the word ego, they called it self-importance. And there's this idea of diminishing that self-importance, of being another word that Carlos Castaneda used that I actually found to be interesting is impeccability. So impeccability is not feeding your ego, not succumbing to it. And that's a very challenging thing to do, because first you have to understand what it is and be able to identify it and identify what's causing the suffering within yourself. And the ego only lives within the rational mind. And so this is also what the Toltecs meant by cleaning the island of the tonal. The rational mind is really the tonal. It's the language-based, logical part of ourselves that is really only capable of perceiving reality at certain degrees. There's these experiences within the psychedelic realms which go outside of its ability to logic and reason through things. Again, at the farthest extreme where all thought actually ceases and then pure experience happens. So the ego lives there, and it's responsible for, I believe, all the miseries and all the damage we cause ourselves and each other and our environment and our planet. And this is where it gets very interesting, that we start to see if this theory is true, and I believe it to be so. The first question then becomes, well, what is the meaning? What are we doing here? And that answer to that is that the universe is attempting to become aware of itself. And so what we are is conduits of awareness, and all of the living beings on this planet are conduits of awareness in certain phases of sophistication or hierarchy towards that awareness. And it appears to me that ego is one of the stopgaps and stumbling blocks. It's one of the obstacles towards the next level of awareness. And in this model, we are then confronted with an illusion, that reality that we are living, this life, is an illusion, and that we are actually this infinite field of energy, completely interconnected. And then this becomes kind of the panpsychic model of consciousness. And I believe that is what's happening. And in this idea here, ego is then a semi-conscious kind of phase along the way. And it appears that it is an integral part of establishing a logical mind frame. And so then it becomes the obstacle to the next level above in this awareness hierarchy. And so I look at science fiction writers, and they seem to be modern day prophets. They've predicted so many things. It's astonishing, their accuracy at times. But there's one thing I think they've gotten incorrect. And I believe what they've gotten incorrect is the idea of a parasitic, malicious alien intelligence that is coming to look for planets to kind of plunder their resources and enslave or remove the dominating species on that planet. And the reason I say that is, to achieve a technological capability of interstellar travel, it's going to be this enormous journey. And along that journey, it appears inevitable that you're going to come across weapons and types of technologies that could fully destroy you and destroy the entire planet along the way. And so if you do not overcome this egoic stopgap in that process, you'll experience an extinction event. And if you look at extinction events on our own planet, you see that at each one, even though it's these eons and eons of time, there's an increased tendency towards further sophistication. We didn't go backwards, right? We didn't, go from dinosaurs to then, the Pleistocene era later, much later on, and then see early hominids, and then all of a sudden revert back to, some sort of tadpoles in the sea sort of model. It's increasing in sophistication. So if we were to experience an extinction event, then we would see an iteration of evolution to the next level of sophistication. And maybe we ourselves would look like the Roswell drawings of little gray or green men with giant eyes and big heads. And then maybe that hardware that's in that big giant head is somehow more capable of overcoming this issue of ego. So the idea being that, and you wouldn't be able to get to interstellar travel and the technological capability, without overcoming the ego that has placed your species outside of harmony with the environment, because you're then dancing with destroying yourself and your environment. And of course, the planet will live on. It can regenerate. It just takes time. So that then becomes the issue, that our evolutionary stopgap towards reaching maybe joining the ranks of potentially other species out there that are interstellar travels is our ego. And so that's what's holding us back from the stars and what's out there beyond. And so then at the biggest level of this series, the idea that since the universe is attempting to become aware of itself, and that awareness is actually, consciousness is actually an integral part of the very fabric of our universe, that at its furthest stretch, as we look maybe several billion years in the future, however long it takes, to where the universe becomes fully aware of itself, it will be a type of second singularity. So the first singularity being the Big Bang, and then other examples of that on much smaller scale would be black holes. But then the next, on the opposite end of this trajectory, would be the universe becoming completely aware of itself, and that would be a second singularity in which we all experience utter and complete bliss for however how long, I don't know. And then maybe it all collapses again and goes right back to the singularity of the Big Bang, and who knows, maybe the journey starts over, or maybe something changes. Who knows? We don't know. I certainly don't know. It's an interesting theory I came across that I've developed, but my experience supports it. My experience with facilitating others, my experience with my own psychedelic journey. Awareness is the balm that heals suffering. The more aware you become, the less you suffer. And it appears that the universe is rather ruthless in this way. One of the examples I like to use is Thich Quang Duc, the iconic monk who lit himself on fire in Saigon in 1963 in Vietnam. The ability to do that is something that is mind-boggling to me, and it points to a higher level of awareness and ability to my understanding of what he has done there is through his extreme discipline and practice of meditation. He's able to leave his body and therefore not feel the pain of being on fire, and therefore also another level of awareness and understanding of what he is or was in relationship to what this universe is and what we all are, is completely interconnected, completely one. So, all right, guys, hopefully you enjoyed that. That's my Psychon talk.